Stalinist Russia were hardly weak, but they merit the designation failed state as fully as any in history. Even in the narrowest interpretation, failed states are identified by the failure to provide security for the population, to guarantee rights at home or abroad, or to maintain functioning, not merely formal, democratic institutions. The concept must surely also cover outlaw states that dismiss with contempt the rules of international order and its institutions, carefully constructed over many years, overwhelmingly under U.S. initiative. The familiar difficulties again arise. The category covers too broad a range to be doctrinally acceptable. The world-dominant power is consciously choosing policies that typify outlaw states, that severely endanger the domestic population, and that undermine substantive democracy. In crucial respects, Washington's adoption of the characteristics of failed and outlaw states is proudly proclaimed. There is scarcely any effort to conceal the tension between a world that still wants a fair and sustainable international legal system, and a single superpower that hardly seems to care that it ranks with Burma, China, Iraq, and North Korea in terms of its adherence to a 17th-century absolutist conception of sovereignty for itself, while dismissing as old-fashioned tommyrot the sovereignty of others. The rich documentary and historical record amply supports Huntington's judgment about creating misimpressions, though it is convenient to plead Cold War paranoia, ignorance, and error. Case by case, we discover from the internal record and other standard sources that there has been rational planning to promote dominant domestic interests. As historian Charles Bergquist concludes in his review of justifications for intervention in Latin America, to conserve faith in liberal democracy, analysts must distort evidence and transform the rational consistency in U.S. policy, the defense of capitalist interests, into irrationality, unfounded fear of communism. The same has regularly been true elsewhere as well. Rational consistency. Quite generally, inquiry reveals that the real enemy of the United States has long been independent nationalism, particularly when it threatens to become a contagious example, to borrow Henry Kissinger's characterization of democratic socialism in Chile, a virus that he feared might infect other countries as far away as southern Europe, a concern he shared with Leonid Brezhnev. The source of contagion, therefore, had to be extirpated, as it was on Tuesday, September 11, 1973. A date often called the first 9/11 in Latin America. We can learn a lot about the most important topic, ourselves, by examining the effects of the two 9/11s on the targeted societies and beyond, as well as the reactions to them. On 9/11 in 1973, after years of U.S. subversion of Chilean democracy, support for terror, and making the economy scream, General Augusto Pinochet's forces attacked the Chilean presidential palace. Salvador Allende, the elected president, died in the palace, apparently committing suicide, because he was unwilling to surrender to the assault that demolished Latin America's oldest and most vibrant democracy, and established a regime of torture and repression. Its primary instrument was the secret police organization, DINA, which U.S. military intelligence compared to the KGB and the Gestapo. Meanwhile, Washington firmly supported Pinochet's regime of violence and terror, and had no slight role in its initial triumph. The official death toll of the first 9/11 is 3,200. The actual toll is commonly estimated at about double that figure. As a proportion of the population, the corresponding figure for the United States would be between 50,000 and 100,000 killed. An official inquiry 30 years after the coup found evidence of 30,000 cases of torture, some 700,000 in the U.S. equivalent. Pinochet soon moved to integrate other U.S.-backed Latin American military dictatorships into an international state terrorist program called Operation Condor. The program killed and tortured mercilessly within the region and branched out to terrorist operations in Europe and the United States. Throughout these hideous crimes, and long after, Pinochet was greatly honored by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in particular, but far more widely as well. The assassination of the respected Chilean diplomat Orlando Letelier in Washington, D.C. in 1976, however, was going too far. Operation Condor had to be called off, but the venom continued to spread. The worst atrocities in Argentina were yet to come, along with the expansion of state terror in Central America by the current incumbents in Washington and their immediate mentors. After 9/11 in 2001, it is commonly agreed the world irrevocably changed. But not after the first 9/11. Those who enjoy wealth, freedom, and privilege might ask how the world would have changed if the oldest democracy in the hemisphere had been destroyed by a military coup, its president killed, more than 50,000 killed, and 700,000 tortured, instigating a plague of terror throughout the continent and beyond. We might also ask how one should respond to those who participated in and laud such actions, or to those who dismiss them as eminently forgettable. The fear of independent nationalism can go to impressive lengths. An illustration is what Senator Baucus called the administration's absurd and increasingly bizarre obsession with Cuba, which has taken precedence over the threat of terror in the Clinton and Bush II administrations, as we have seen. The obsession may be bizarre, but it is not absurd from the perspective of policymakers. The basic reasons were explained in internal documents from the Kennedy-Johnson years. State Department planners warned that the very existence of the Castro regime is successful defiance of U.S. policies going back 150 years. The threat is not Russians, but intolerable defiance of the master of the hemisphere, much like Iran's crime of successful defiance in 1979, or Syria's rejection of Clinton's demands. By June 1960, longtime presidential advisor Adolph Burley, a former member of FDR's Brain Trust, warned that this is the end of the Monroe Doctrine. The savagery and fanaticism of the assault on Cuba has been indeed remarkable, so much so that the U.S. Army War College in 1993 cautioned against the innate emotional appeal driving U.S. policymakers, who saw Castro as the embodiment of evil, who must be punished for his defiance of the United States, as well as for other reprehensible deeds. The punishment of the people of Cuba intensified when Cuba was in dire straits after the collapse of the Soviet Union, at the initiative of liberal Democrats. The author of the 1992 measures to tighten the blockade proclaimed that my objective is to wreak havoc in Cuba. Representative Robert Torricelli of New Jersey, later senator. That punishment of the population was legitimate had been determined as far back as the Eisenhower administration. The Cuban people are responsible for the regime, Undersecretary of State Douglas Dillon explained in March 1960. So the United States has the right to cause them to suffer by economic strangulation. Eisenhower approved economic sanctions in the expectation that if the Cuban people are hungry, they will throw Castro out. Kennedy agreed that the embargo would hasten Fidel Castro's departure as a result of the rising discomfort among hungry Cubans. Along with expanding the embargo, Kennedy initiated a major terrorist campaign designed to bring the terrors of the earth to Cuba, the goal of Robert Kennedy, who was put in charge of the operation, according to his biographer Arthur Schlesinger. The basic thinking was expressed by Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Lester Mallory in April 1960. Castro would be removed through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship, so every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba in order to bring about hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of the government. U.S. leaders could not tolerate Cuban refusal to submit to the United States. The reaction of a people still convinced that they have a right of self-determination and national sovereignty.